Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilpert coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. Inequality in the world, and specifically in the United States, has been gaining more and more attention recently. Last week, the Pew Research Center released a new study on the size of the middle class in the US and in 10 European countries. The study found that the middle class shrank significantly in the US in the last 2 decades from 1991 to 2010. While it also shrank in several other Western European countries, it shrank far more in the US than anywhere else. Meanwhile, another study, also released last week and published in the journal Science, shows that class mobility in the US declined dramatically in the 1980s relative to the generation before that. Finally, a book released last March by MIT economist Peter Temin argues that the US is increasingly becoming what economists call a dual economy. That is, where there are two economies in effect. And one of the populations lives in an economy that is prosperous and secure, and the other part of the population lives in an economy that resembles those of some third world countries. Joining us to talk about all of this from Cambridge, Massachusetts, is Professor Temin, the author of the book, The Vanishing Middle Class, Prejudice and Power in a Dual Economy. He's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thanks, Professor Temin, for making the time to talk about your book today.
Okay, thank you. Glad to be here.
So you begin your book with an analysis of the middle class, kind of like what the Pew study does that I mentioned in my introduction. You show that the middle class's income as a percentage of all incomes has been shrinking between 1970 and 2014. At the same time, the upper class income grew significantly. So I want to ask first, how do you define the middle class, and what conclusions do you draw from the shrinking income of the middle class?
The middle class is shrinking in the United States. And I argue in my book that this is an effect of both the advance of technology and American policies. That is shown dramatically in the new study because the United States is compared with many European countries, and in some of them, the middle class is expanding in the last 2 decades, and in others, it's decreasing. And while technology crosses national borders, national policies affect things within the country. And I argue that in the United States, our policies have divided us into 2 groups: above the median income, above the middle class, is what I call the FTE sector, finance, technology, and electronics sector, of people who are doing well and whose incomes are rising as our national product is growing. The middle class and below are losing shares of income, and their incomes are shrinking, as the Pew studies, both of them show. And I argue, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, before we go into the issue of the dual economy, I just want to look at some of the explanations for what has been happening. That is, you show another interesting graph, which shows the relationship between the average wages and productivity between 1945 and I think it was 2014. And it clearly shows that while the two lines, productivity and average wages, grew in parallel from 1945 to the 1970s. After the 1970s, they began to diverge very strongly, and wages remained stagnant, and while productivity continued to increase at the same rate as before. What is the significance of this divergence, and why would you say that these two lines have begun to diverge?
Okay, thank you. They diverged in the 1970s by policies that were the result of a backlash against the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. And so the policies were against unions, were a reorganization of industry and a variety of things on that side. They were also the results of decontrol of the national economy. It started under President Nixon and then were expanded greatly under President Reagan in the early 1980s. But the wage divergence from the overall productivity began almost immediately. And the progress that came was partly electronics and the things that we know about communication that allowed businesses to control the activities of people and allowed then large firms to spin off a variety of their activities. So that instead of making a wage decision about their ordinary, less skilled workers, they made a purchasing decision to hire a company that supervised these people. And that was good for the company because it emphasized their core value and was reflected in their share price on the stock market. But it was bad for consumers because, for workers, because there was an ethical, an equity consideration on wage decisions where wages of the less skilled workers were to keep up with the wages of the highly skilled ones, but a purchasing decision or a subcontracting decision had none of these equity available.
I just want to turn to now the question about the dual economy. I mean, we've established, or you've established, that the middle class is definitely shrinking, also according to these other studies. But how do you reach the conclusion that there are two economies in the US, that is a dual economy? I mean, after all, why not talk about perhaps a triple economy, one for the poor, one for the middle class, and one for the upper class? Why a dual economy?
Yeah. Well, I use that model because the model, which is an old model from the 1950s, shows that the FTE sector makes policy for itself and really does not consider how well the low-wage sector is doing. In fact, it wants to keep wages and earnings low in the low-wage sector to provide cheap labor for the industrial employment. But the people in the United States in the FTE sector are largely ignorant of what's going on in the low-wage sector. For example, about this time also started an increase in criminal employment, resulting now in the United States having more people in prison relative to its population than any other advanced country in the world. And most people in the FTE sector are not aware of this. Prisons are located in rural areas. The judicial processes take place there. And people are not conscious of this at all. But having a lot of people in prison then rebounds badly on public education in the neighborhoods that these people come from, and the discussion of urban education never refers to mass incarceration. It doesn't really provide any extra resources to compensate the kids who are involved, who are affected by having so many adults in prison. And so the dual economy helps to take these disparate things about mass incarceration and education and see the connections between them. And the connections, I argue, are because the dual economy, they are in their own dual economy, and they make rules and laws and so on for their own benefit and are punitive or neglectful of things going on in the low-wage sector.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thanks so much, Professor Temin, for having joined us today to talk about your book, The Vanishing Middle Class.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.